All right, super. So, hi, Dr. Don Rowe. You're a researcher and assistant professor in special education and clinical sciences at the University of Oregon, and we want to thank you for your time to discuss your research today. And let's see, the article that we wanted to ask you about was Predictors of Post-School Success, a systematic review of NLT S2 secondary analyses. And what do you think is most interesting about this study?
So this study actually builds, I guess just to give you a little history, with the No Child Left Behind Act, there was a big push for teachers both in general and special education to use evidence-based practices and programs. And then that was echoed again in IDEA 2004, so that, that teachers were required to use practices in the classroom that had evidence to support their effectiveness. And so there's a couple types of research that lend themselves to identification of evidence-based practices. So you've got experimental literature, which are like group design studies or single case studies that are causal in nature. So if you do this, then you see these effects. And so David Test and some colleagues back in 2009 conducted a systematic review to identify evidence-based practices in secondary transition. And so this work actually builds on some of that earlier work. Dr. Test also had a group in 2009 that identified or reviewed correlational literature. So that's the other type of literature there is. And so correlational literature is not causal in nature, but it talks about if students participate in this, then they're more likely to achieve these outcomes. And that literature is super important when we're thinking about secondary transition, because it's really focused on the services that students provide or the programs that are available, or in some instances, is actually skill sets. So what skill sets do they have that lead to better outcomes? And so that was the one piece of literature that kind of bridges the gap between what happens in school and then what happens at post-school. So this systematic review actually builds on that original Test et al. 2009 article. So we went back and reviewed, so it was a systematic review of the literature to identify additional evidence for the existing predictors, and then see if any more literature had been published that identified new skills or new programs that led to the evidence-based. And so it was really nice because there's a lot of articles that have been published since the 2009 article. So we actually went back to 2009 to do the review. And identified all the key articles that would be included, and then analyzed. I guess one of the most exciting kind of results of this particular review was the fact that one of the original predictors was self-determination skills, and then just students having high levels of self-determination leads to the likelihood of better post-school outcomes. But during this review, because of the study started looking a little deeper and looking at individual subsets of skills under that umbrella of self-determination, like goal setting, youth autonomy, and decision making, we're able to kind of separate out, because self-determination is a really big piece, and so, or a really big kind of concept. So I think that was probably one of the most exciting things. And the other, I guess, most exciting finding was around travel training and travel skills. We, as teachers, kind of know that's super important, but it's really nice to have some research evidence to back it up. So when our principals are asking, why in the world are you teaching kids how to ride a bus, then we can say, because if they know how to get from here to there, then they're more likely to have better outcomes. So that's probably some of the most exciting pieces. So I think part of the systematic review, I guess the best thing is it's a nice way to help practitioners identify what are those key practices or key things they need to be doing in the classroom in order to ensure students with disabilities have better outcomes. That's probably the most exciting part about it.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Yeah, very, very thorough, and also, and you already addressed some of the outcomes of the study. Jackie, did you have any follow-up questions about outcomes or implications for practice?
No, she kind of mentioned that. So
I noticed in the study also, it seemed that your review was a little more inclusive than test. Correlational study. Would you say that's accurate in order to kind of get like a broader sense of like potentially valuable?
Well, it was probably because we only focused on, in this review, we only focused on those articles that did a secondary analysis of the NLTS2 data, which actually excludes some correlational research that's used state data sets. And so we're actually in the process of conducting a new review that is more inclusive. So there's actually, since as soon as this article was published, like 50 more studies that did secondary analysis of NLTS2 was published. And so it's like, oh no, there's already time for another review. And the fact that we left out or didn't include any articles that use statewide databases to do correlational analysis out of this article, this new review is actually more inclusive, where we're including articles that did any kind of secondary analysis of either state level data or other extant data sources like NLTS2 to better capture all the information. I'm not sure that this review captured all that could have been captured. I think we'd open up a little bit more to identify some of those other articles that use statewide databases, which probably, and we only cut out a few, but we may have had some slightly different findings. I mean, I guess the biggest shocker was I assumed that there was going to be a lot more new predictors identified. But what we found is that the research is just continuing to research the same old things and looking at it in different ways. And the fact that the researchers, and I'm hoping this changes in this next review, but they're still doing really exploratory studies. There are not a lot of studies that are going in there a priori, meaning that they have research questions going in to the study and to identify their models, and so they know they're expecting to find something. Most of the studies that are included in this review were simply exploratory, where they threw in everything but the kitchen sink and then see what they could find. And so they just kept adding variables until they found a good model, and that's good. That's necessary for research, but I think there's sufficient amount of exploratory research out there in this area that it's now time to start thinking about, okay, what do we expect to happen? So for certain populations, I'm thinking with a new review that's going to start coming out. I know it started slightly with these articles that they were doing specific or looking at specific populations. So looking at predictors specific for individuals with autism or individuals with intellectual disabilities. And so I think that in this next review that we're doing, those things will pop up. But it's kind of unfortunate. I really thought that we would find a whole lot more new practices, but instead we just found a lot more evidence to support the existing predictors.
Okay.
So you kind of answered as well, where do you think educational research is heading? So what do you think it would take for someone to do that, as like find more practices and research in that area? Like, since you're saying people are just kind of researching the same thing over and over, like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for, researchers, I think they just need to come in with some sound research questions. If there are some existing data sets out there now with a new movement towards the use of longitudinal data systems at the state level, which just means that all the data is kind of housed in one system, or that they have multiple systems that talk to each other. So you can do some of these types of analysis with state level data. I think that, researchers just need to go in and with key research questions, identify it ahead of time, and then do the analysis and see what comes up, and then understand if they're not positive findings. That's important too, and to report those and publish those as well as all the positive findings. I think that's and just be clear in the methods. I think we're moving in that direction. Special education, although it seems like it's a old field and it's been around forever, is still actually a new kind of emerging field in research. It's not near as researched as some of the other academic areas in education, and so we don't have a lot of interventions out there that have been identified as evidence-based. We don't have a lot of programs out there or a lot of predictors, which they do in general ed. So I think we just need to continue to do the research, and then also probably more importantly is to help bridge that research to practice gap. So it's really a challenge for teachers to be able to understand how to implement the practices once they get in. So it's not like you can read a journal article and know exactly what you need to do in your classroom. And then some teachers don't even have access to the journals because they're not associated with the university, or they didn't, or their professional organization that would get them. So we have to do a better job as researchers after we conduct all the research to really build tools and other strategies to support teachers in implementing the practices. We are doing some of that kind of work in secondary transition through the professional organization. So Council for Exceptional Children's Division on Career Development and Transition. I'm on the board, and we're doing a lot of work through that organization to help bridge that research to practice gap. But it's a challenge. I think we're always going to be challenged with it, but we just have to keep moving forward.
Okay, and then one last question, just if you have a couple minutes, what are some of the limitations of this particular study? And then what was one predictor that you found stood out most, or what was the best predictor for post-secondary success?
Okay, so the limitations really have to do with the data set that all of these articles used in their analysis. So they used the NLTS2 data set, which currently is old. The last data collection occurred in 2009, and so it's old data at this point. And so and it was self-reported data. So they conducted a survey. So it's report data. And there's lots of issues around weighting that's super complicated, that it's even hard for the folks that actually collected the data to explain. So that is probably one of the largest limitations, and that's actually a limitation that's identified in every article we reviewed for this particular systematic review, that particular data set. The other limitation for us is that we didn't actually analyze the negative findings. In some cases, negative findings actually support a predictor. So, there's cases where, depending on how it was worded, it may be a negative correlation, but it actually supports either that skill development or supports that program. And we didn't do an analysis of the negative findings across studies. I think that's another study to come. I think we're going to get some really important information to help us understand what works and what doesn't work from doing that. And maybe we might potentially do that for this next review. I'm not 100% positive just yet because we're still in the midst of reviewing the articles. But that's probably one of the, and the other limitation is we just limited ourselves to the NLTS2 secondary analysis articles. I think had we expanded, we may have had different findings, but it is what it is. So I guess the predictor actually that has across the Test et al. 2009 and this review, the predictor that has the strongest evidence to support post-school outcomes is having employment experiences while youth are in school. So having paid employment particularly. So if students are either getting doing paid internships or working during the summers or after school jobs or any kind of paid employment experience while they're still in high school. That is a predictor across all three outcome areas. So it predicts future employment, future post-secondary education and training, and future independent living. It's probably, the reason it's the strongest is because it's the most researched. So if you think about kind of the history of secondary transition, there was a huge focus in early years on career development. And so that's where a lot of that research came from. So in the 80s, that's what they were researching was employment. And in the early 90s, still working on employment. So that's probably why now it has the strongest or the most number of high quality studies to support the evidence base. Although there's some others emerging. I think self-determination skills, in particular breaking it down, looking at goal setting, looking at self-management, looking at youth autonomy decision-making. I think those are going to be emerging and have a lot of strong evidence because there's a lot of researchers out there right now looking at those skills and how to teach those skills in the classroom. So I think that's kind of coming down the pike. There's less life skills type interventions, which is kind of disappointing for me because I think they're super important. You know, understanding how to manage your finances, understanding how to get from here to there. I think those are all key pieces for community inclusion. Sorry. I think those are key pieces for community inclusion, and I think they should be incorporated and researched more, but they're not. So I'll just continue to do my line of research and then hope others follow along. But that's kind of where it stands. Like I said, we'll see what happens with this next review to see if we get any additional things that pop up.
Very good. Dr. Rowe, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and your very thorough answers, and gave us a lot of good insights into your research. And we look forward to corresponding with you more in the future.
Thank you.
Sure. Give me a call whenever.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, too.